I want to thank you so much to Professor Carlo Fabricatore, which is present here, our first ever keynote speaker, not only our first keynote speaker of the day, but our first keynote speaker ever. I wanted to briefly present Carlo. Carlo is an industrial engineer, human factors researcher, and game designer. His work is driven by a profound interest and concern for complex problems in socio-technical systems and how to leverage technology to enable people to build better futures together. He has an extended academic experience in human factors, serious games, and game-based learning, leading numerous international research projects and developing multiple international game design education programs. Carlo is currently full professor of serious gaming at E.H.E. Europa, Hochschule EurAKA in Switzerland, where he oversees advanced research on the application of human factors engineering, gamification, and ubiquitous computing in mental health care, education, and sustainable development. He is also visiting professor of human factors in technology-enhanced healthcare at E.H.E. University in Italy, where he leads cutting-edge research in music and game-based interventions to foster healthy aging and social integration in elderly populations. Carlo has also significant industrial experience in information technologies and digital games, collaborating with organizations including Microsoft, Accenture, Nintendo, Ubisoft, and the United Nations. And this is also a very good part of it. Outside work, Carlo is a keen guitar player and a passionate sports angler who enjoys venturing in remote places in the pursuit of the ultimate immersion in nature. And as you can see, it's more than a perfect fit for Glow. So now I'll pass on the word to Carlo, and thank you so much once again for being here with us, and for everyone, enjoy your day.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Carlo.
Sorry, just another note, if possible, for the non-presenters to switch off your cameras during presentation, it will enhance the quality of the transmission. Thank you so much.
Right. So as I was saying, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for having me here in the first place. It's a great pleasure to be here on this very special occasion. So it's actually, as you said, the launch of what I think is going to be a very interesting event in the future. So yes, today, and let me share my screen so that we can get straight into the business. So today, what I would like to discuss with you is, there you go, is an area of particular interest. Let me see, I don't think I have the right one, as usual. It's an area of particular interest to me, and there is, can you just confirm if you have my screen now? Yeah, okay.
Yes, it's working, Carlo.
Excellent. Okay, so it's an area of particular interest to me, which is the area of consequential wicked problems. And it's an area which I think should drive us to an urgent reconsideration of what we mean by learning and the role that serious games, or in general, I prefer to talk about consequential games, can have to learn about how to tackle these kind of problems. So let's start immediately with what these kind of problems are, because actually they are conditioning significantly the world in which we are living. And I will take one example which is surrounding us as we speak, and that's the COVID pandemic, which is really a very clear example of these kind of consequential problems. If you think about the pandemics, it all started with a virus, but after the virus, it was really havoc. And it was a particular type of havoc which involved many different factors that interacted in different ways with a variety of consequences, most of them negative, some of them positive, and it's still going on, and it's still evolving, it's still developing, and we don't know where this is going to go. So if I asked you, do you know what the problem is? Do you know where the causes, what the causes of this problem are? And do you know what the solutions could be? You would probably, just like myself, be unable to point the finger at causes, clear solutions. And I wouldn't be able to blame you, really, because that's the nature of the beast. This is what wicked consequential problems are about. And more in detail, yes, pandemics are wicked consequential problems. And this is not the COVID-19, it's not the first one. We've seen others before. They were not as close to us in Europe as the COVID-19 pandemic was, perhaps, but there have been more. But there are other wicked consequential problems that we've witnessed. Global terrorism is a wicked consequential problem, and global warming, and global financial crisis, and even racial discrimination is a wicked consequential problem. And the reason why we called these problems wicked is that they cannot be definitively solved. They're not fully controllable, and they require a continuous effort to manage them, influence them, focusing on the common good. I know this may sound like something that should be done and should be tackled, and it should be relatively easy for us to get together, think about the common good and do something about that, but it's not at all. And just to demonstrate that, let me flag this chart, which is quite interesting, and it's quite an interesting demonstration, in my view, of how difficult it is to pinpoint what the common good means. So this chart represents trends in contagions, and it's actually from a newspaper from yesterday. You may know that trends have been fluctuating, and here in the UK, we have a very interesting situation. We are actually in the top curve situation, and it doesn't matter what the other curves are. It doesn't matter if you cannot read, because what I want you to look at is the difference between the curves, is how far higher above the curve in the UK is. And it's quite interesting because over here, the reasoning in the UK, the reasoning about the common good has been completely different than in other countries. And there have been striking similarities in other countries in terms of considering the common good, keeping contagions low. Whereas here in the UK, there is a greater concern for the economy, for the implications that the economy is going to have for the well-being of the population, and so on and so forth. And you can see the results. So is one decision better than the other? It depends, but the reason why I flagged this chart is that I wanted to emphasize how difficult it can be to really pinpoint what the common good is and work towards it. Anyways, let's get into the details of these kind of problems, and let's try to understand why they are so complicated to tackle, why it is urgent to learn how to tackle that, and what learning how to tackle that implies. So these kind of wicked consequential problems are actually the result of the interplay of a great many factors which come from the economy, the society, the environment, and these great many factors interact in great many ways, which makes them complicated. Actually, we call these problems complex problems, and that complexity is more than complicatedness. So the number of factors, the number of interactions, and different areas which the factors come from make them complicated, but there is more. The way these factors interact with one another changes over time. That's quite interesting because it changes in an autonomous way, on top of changes in reaction of our attempts to change things. So again, if you think about the pandemic, there are things that evolve, and it doesn't matter what we try to do, things keep evolving. And that means actually that one thing that we might believe is good to do today might not be so good today tomorrow. And that's this idea of constant change being one characteristic that defines the complexity of these problems and why they are so difficult to tackle. Autonomous and adaptive change then leads to another challenge, which is what we call emergence. So basically what happens is that you have these emergent effects that you cannot possibly predict if you look at isolated factors and isolated interactions between factors. In very simple terms, this is what Aristotle called the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. And this is what defines, in large measure, the unpredictability of these kind of problems. And last but not least, you have conflict. This is not really about getting together and sitting at the table and finding the common good, because my interests and my needs may be different than your interests and your needs. And on top of that, mine and yours may be in conflict with the interest of the environment. So there is conflict. And addressing these kind of problems requires addressing conflict, negotiating, identifying the best possible future, and so on and so forth. Putting all this together, you have the kind of complexity that I was talking about that makes these problems particularly challenging to tackle. Because of the unknowability, you cannot know it all. Because of the unpredictability that characterizes them, because the uncertainty that characterizes them, and because all this together makes these problems non-fully controllable, these situations non-fully controllable. So how should these kind of situations be tackled? Well, iteratively. The process which is required to tackle these situations is what we call adaptive problem management. It's not about adaptive problem solving, it's management. Because remember, you cannot solve them. You cannot find a definitive solution, and that's it. The problem is gone. No, they're not going to go away, firstly, and you cannot definitively solve them. So what you have to do is iteratively and cyclically figure out what the best thing to do under the present situation might be. And so you explore and evaluate a situation, you think about future improvements, you think about current state, you think about the needs, and you decide what could be the best thing to do right here, right now. Then you plan how to do it, and then you do it. But as you do it, you have to be prepared, not just to execute the plan and do it, but you have to be prepared and monitor the situation. And monitor the situation because whatever changes, whether it is because of what you're doing or because, remember, these things change autonomously, whatever changes should lead you to change your plans and also explore and evaluate more, make sense of the situation more. And this is ongoing. It never ends, it never ends, it never ends. So it's quite different than what we traditionally think as problem solving. All this is challenging. Why? In the first place, because you have to think and make decisions in absence of certain information. The information that you will rely on is incomplete, and even what you have is uncertain, and you still have to decide, right? And that's difficult, but it's also difficult because this iterative nature of this process means actually that there is no sticking to the plan. You don't have your beautiful plan and then you just, you decided that's good. We all agree, let's move on. Nope. You have to forego the illusion of control. And that's not just operationally difficult, it's also psychologically difficult, foregoing control. And also, you have to continuously make sense of the situation. And because you have to continuously make sense of the situation, you have another challenge. You have to accept that you will have never figured it out. Another important psychological impact, another important thing that defines attitudes that you have to embrace in order to be able to tackle these problems. And altogether, this means, as I suggested before, that not only you have to continuously revise the situation in order to adapt your plans, but you also have to question your own beliefs and change them because they may be wrong. So that actually means that you have to continuously learn through this process with a mechanism that we call, or some of us call, double loop learning. One loop to revise your plans, another loop to revise your beliefs, your worldviews, and you have to adapt your worldviews. So there is a lot of adaptation that concerns not only your rational decisions, but also your attitudes towards the world. And last but not least, you have to do all this with others. So it's not about you, it's about you as a collective, not individuals. And this begs the question, how do you learn this? Where do you learn this? What is it that you really need to learn? And let's get into this. So the way of developing this kind of adaptive problem management capability is through intending learning as an action-based integrative meaning-making process. So let's see what we're talking about exactly. First of all, let's get one thing out of the way. Who should learn this? We're talking about big problems here, but I wouldn't like you to think about big people having to deal with big problems, because everybody can influence wicked problem situations. Everybody is affected by them. Everybody needs to adapt to them, and everybody can affect them. Having said that, let's focus briefly on what needs to be learned. Being that the objective here is striving for the common good and coping with the complexity of wicked problem situations, which means actually adapting, and as I said before, exploring, planning, implementing, revising plans, revising worldviews, and all that iteratively, but always keeping in mind the common good. If you put all these together, then you have inevitably to consider that learning is an integrative process of development of knowledge, attitudes, and skills. And this is already something that is not common as a perspective in formal educational environments, right? There's a lot of focus on knowledge. There's a lot of focus on skills, never mind what the knowledge is, never mind what the skills are. But what I found in my experience and looking at the literature is that the focus on attitudes is very limited. Well, if you want to tackle these kind of problems, you need the three, and the three have to be developed together. Because the three together, and only the three together, can form a mental toolbox, which is suitable to think, feel, and do about the world in the pursuit of the common good, in a way that will ultimately make you feel that you're going to be bringing about order from chaos. And so, more in detail, when we talk about knowledge, and I refer to this as knowledge representations, we're talking about representations that have to be contextualized. If you're focusing on helping people learn how to deal with wicked consequential problems, abstract knowledge is pointless. Knowledge has to be contextualized in the scenario of interest. It has to be transdisciplinary, in that it has to be holistic, it has to integrate different areas, all equally relevant for the situation of interest, and it has to be pluralistic, meaning that whatever knowledge is required to tackle these kind of problems, it has to reflect different perspectives on the subject at hand, on the issue at hand, even if those perspectives are conflictive. Then moving to skills, of course, you need operational skills, and operational skills, it's all about learning how to use object purposefully. But again, you have in context. You want to understand how things work, how they can be used in the context of interest. But you also need to work with others, remember. So you need actually a pretty beefy social skill set, which in the end should allow you to elicit and understand other people's perspective through the dialogue. It should allow you to formulate shared worldviews and purposes, and then plan joint action to pursue shared goals. And last but not least, you need higher order thinking skills. I will not enter into details. The idea is not making exhaustive lists. There's a lot of literature on this, but one thing that I would like to flag about higher order thinking skill sets is that they should help you to formulate mental representations based on incomplete information, hypothesize, guess what might happen in the future, what kind of better future could be feasible, and then identify possibilities to change what you have now into one of those better futures. And if you put all these together in the end, and to simplify really this notion, what all this should serve, what the purpose of this kind of skills should be, is collaborative and iterative guesswork. And by guesswork, I mean a process in which you continuously and constantly analyze a situation, you draw a conclusion, you synthesize, and you draw a conclusion thinking about future, so anticipating what might happen for good or bad. And you do this continuously. And one thing that I would like to highlight is that in this process, you have forms of reasoning which are required and are actually developed by education as it stands at the moment, right? You have inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, but there is one type of reasoning which is actually not always in the radar. And I would say it's very rarely considered as important by formal education, and that's abductive reasoning. And that's about taking your best shot. You have incomplete information, you have uncertain information, make a decision, go try, see what happens, and then reconsider. That's something that formal education, in my experience, and to my knowledge at least, doesn't do very well. In fact, quite the opposite. We punish people who fail. So in that sense, we do not encourage this kind of abductive reasoning, the take your best shot kind of reasoning. And then I left the best for last, or what to me is probably the most interesting, the most in need area, which is attitudes. So what happens with attitudes is that you do need a number of key attitudes in order to be able to tackle these kind of problems. And you need hope, you need connectedness, you need empathy, you need altruism, responsibility, adaptivity, confidence. All together, these attitudes should define a worldview intended as a sense of connectedness with the world in which you are concerned about the others, you are concerned about the environment, you're determined to do something good for the others and the environment. You have confidence in that whatever you do individually and collectively can generate effects, and you have to have hope that those effects effectively can change the situation towards the achievement of the common good. And last but not least, you have to embrace change. Embracing change means that you have to accept that change is not bad, it's just the natural conditions. Things change and they change uncontrollably. As you embrace this idea, what you need to do is also thinking that as things change, you can also change, adapting and evolving. And therefore, you have to be ready to reconsider whatever your worldviews are and change them, because that's going to be good. Ultimately, if you put all these together, really the ultimate synthesis is that you're going to be ready to engage with wicked problem situations because you will care about the situation and you will be committed to do something about the situation. So when we talk about learning how to deal with these kind of problems, well, knowledge, skill set, but you also need these kind of attitudes because you need to care and you need to be committed about the situation. Now, how to develop this kind of knowledge, skills, and attitudes integratively? You need to consider the learning process as a meaning-making process, and as a meaning-making process which can only unfold through practical activity. right? I know there is a lot of talking about experience-based learning. There is a lot of that in this kind of discourse. Let me try to illustrate in detail what I'm talking about through the help of my assistant here, Panchito. So Panchito is any guy. And any guy, any person engaged in activity is going to be automatically and inevitably engaged in an integrative learning process, because that person is going to be facing a context. That person is going to sense the context and is going to interpret that context. And by interpreting that context, what I mean is that person is going to form and update mental images. And these mental images, and this is quite an interesting thing, we're not talking about just rational interpretation of the context. We're actually talking about mental images that reflect how Panchito feels about the world that he is sensing, as much as what Panchito thinks rationally about that world. Integrative. And these kind of mental images will define whatever Panchito believes concerning why action is needed, what needs to be done, how to do it, when and where. And ultimately, putting all this together, this is going to drive Panchito's planning and motivation, and therefore action. Because all these kind of mental images will be used to actually interact with the world. And what Panchito is going to sense about the world and process into these mental images is, of course, objects that Panchito needs to deal with in order to improve a situation, right? But it's also tools that can be used to improve the situation. It's rules that need to be taken into account. It's a community, it's other people who may be involved, who may help, or who may be affected by the situation. It's division of labor schemas, which dictate how we can work together in a given situation. And it's how all these things together can interact and can ultimately serve Panchito and his community to pursue a shared goal. So through this process, and this is an iterative process that unfolds through activity, through this process, what's going to happen is that this process of formation and update of mental images will lead to learning or unlearning, changing what you've learned before, right? And those images will reflect integratively knowledge, attitude, and skill sets. Now think about that. How can you promote that kind of learning process? And this is actually my last beefy point, because I think that games can play an important role in this context. If you really want to know what I think about games, I think we should focus less and less on teaching maths and teaching arithmetics and teaching these kind of things, because I think that the big potential of games and the big need is precisely focused on this kind of problem situations and what they can do to help people learn how to tackle these problem situations. So first of all, why talking about games at all? It's not because they're fun, right? Let's get this out of the way. To me, the biggest point of interest is that games allow simulating systems suitable to elicit APM, that kind of integrative development through meaning making of knowledge, skill sets, and attitudes in a protected environment. With that out of the way, games need to present some specific features in order to be suitable to promote this learning process. First, the gameplay process has to be focused on eliciting goal-oriented tasks, open-ended, no definitive solutions, ongoing management for ongoing improvement. Gameplay tasks should be collective. They should be feedback driven. You have to think about to what extent the game speaks to the player and what the game says or tells to the player. Games need to be designed considering the importance of context. The context has to, of course, be authentic. It has to mimic real world situations, right? But the context also has to promote a motivation. Something meaningful to the player has to happen in the context. It shouldn't be a simulation, a sterile simulation of phenomena. It should move the player to feel something, care about the world. It should foster a collective sense of collective need. And it should also foster a sense that players can do something about whatever they care about within the game through the simulated scenarios. Then it should support learning, of course, but it has to be the integrative learning. It shouldn't be about just knowledge or skills or attitudes altogether. And it should support that through iterative meaning making, leading the player to constantly trying to make sense of whatever happens, whatever changes in their surrounding. Now, of course, it should implement complexity. It should simulate this idea of ongoing change, uncontrollable to some extent, uncertain to some extent. And when I say to some extent, it's about tuning complexity so that players will engage with it without being crushed by it. Last but not least, what you want to do is design to measure. And this is something that it's not just about this kind of games or these kind of problems. I think it's a big issue in the field of game-based learning. There's the design and then there are measurements, and sometimes you feel that the game has not been designed to be measured. Well, here you need to do that. You need to think about how to articulate the player experience because you want to measure something. For example, you want to measure decision-making, something about decision-making, some indicators of adaptation, and so on and so forth. In order to tackle game design this way in analysis, basically you need systemic perspectives. Systemic perspectives that drive your analytical and or design work, thinking about what might influence the player experience, how the player experience can be influenced, and then which activity features you need to think about in order to monitor the player experience, and later on how to assess whatever you'll be monitoring. And just to conclude, this is just a quick glimpse how this is then, how it lands in the world of game design and analysis. You have to think about this. You have to think about what the player is going to do in terms of meaning making all the time. And you have to think that whatever you put in the game is going to affect a player's ability to interact with the game. You're going to give tools, objectives, motivation, sense of purpose. Then you're going to give tools. And then you're going to constantly convey information to the player, and that information is going to feed the formation and update of mental images. So you have to think about what the iterative gameplay activity processes that you put in your game are, to what extent they lead the player to iteratively go through phases of goal setting, motive formation, evaluation of environmental conditions, planning, execution, evaluation of outcomes all the time. You have to think about whatever you have in the game and to what extent that can serve as a tool for practical interaction with the game, but also as an informative tool to convey to players information that ultimately can define the way they perceive the world and the attitudes that they develop towards the world. And in doing so, that information has to be designed thinking about the desirable meaning-making processes that you want to promote. What kind of knowledge representations you would like players to promote, what kind of assessments you would like players to engage in, what you would like them to consider right, wrong, better, worse, the attitudes, what you would like players to care about. You can trigger that through information. And what kind of operational decisions you would like to promote through the game. And last but not least, you have to think about gameplay analytics. So if you have tools, if you have activities, if you have stages, if you have information, et cetera, you're going to have players doing things. How do you measure that? How do you make the game recording information that you can later on use to assess the player experience? Not just the learning, but the player experience as an iterative process, not just outcome, but assess the process. And so I know this was a lot of information, but I really think that this is a battlefield. This is something that us people interested in leveraging games to promote desirable learning, or we should consider this field as an urgent priority. And this is why I would like to conclude inviting you to act together. Let's join forces. My work at the moment is focused on education, is focused on healthcare. I'm engaged in numerous projects that reflect a little bit the kind of attempts and the kind of things that I've been talking about through this presentation. But I think that we should all try to work together in order to develop games, apply them, see what happens, evaluate them, develop instruments to evaluate games, the player experience, the outcomes, ongoing, constantly, in all the domains that require it. And with this, I conclude thanking you. And if there is any question, I'll be happy to address them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlo.
Pleasure.
So it was actually a very, very enlightening presentation. And now I will probably pass on the word to the audience, so we can have some discussion. We have already a question on the chat, so probably I will start by this. Yeah. I don't know if Conceição wants to make the question or want me to read it.
Hi. Okay, I can ask the question. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you, Fabio, for an inspiring speech. I'm wondering, when listening to you, that complexity is not necessarily a complicated issue. But about the problems, I understood that you say that complicatedness is part of complexity. So can you elaborate a little more? Thank you.
Absolutely. That's actually one thing that is not that straightforward to get and clarify. So complicatedness is about the number of parts and the number of interactions, but it doesn't change. So let me illustrate this with a simple example. If you take a watch, if you take a beautiful Swiss watch, right? Yeah. That is complicated. You have plenty of mechanisms, plenty of little parts that interact with one another. That is a complicated system, that watch, right? And if you open the watch without any knowledge, you might actually be unable to understand how it works. You might try to disassemble it and still not understand it. But with time and resources, so you learn, or you get with people who learn, you can figure it out. You can actually control complicatedness, right? And then you can fix it, you can change it, you can create a new one, whatever it is. So complicatedness is about number of parts and number of ways in which these parts interact. Complexity, you have that, but then things change. So you open your watch, you figure it out, and then you try to put things together, and you see that some of those mechanisms changed whilst you were trying to figure out how to do something with that watch. So you have this idea of change, and change that cannot be predicted entirely. So that's the relationship between complicatedness being one step towards complexity, and then complexity being, you add this element of autonomous change to something that is already complicated. That is really the relationship. And one last quick thing, that kind of change is not chaos. I said not fully predictable, because if you look frequently enough, you will see that there are patterns. And then you will be able to make your best guess. So you will see one change and you will see it again and you will see it again. In other words, history repeats itself.
Yeah.
And that's the other important thing about these kind of systems.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlo. Now I will pass the word to Benjamin. Choose next.
All right. Hey, so first of all, thank you so much for your talk, Carlo. It was really interesting. I really appreciate your work. However, like, I have a question, because I've been also dealing in my research with game analytics and the problem of making behavior or coming up with the proper metric to measure behavior. However, knowing the industry with their non-disclosure agreements on certain practices, how do you think that it's, I mean, it is an issue that researchers are on one side developing methods of trying to bring in change or analytics or methods, basically, while the industry has kind of their own research going on, and there's like this gap that where things are not being shared. And I'd like just to ask you for your opinion on that, if you think that it would make sense to eventually find a way to bridge that gap between industry and research.
Yes. So I have two thoughts. But first of all, I agree that there is such a gap, and an effort is needed. But I would like to share two perspectives on that situation, what the situation is at the moment. So first of all, if I look at how the world of game analytics has evolved in the past 5 years, well, very many interesting things have emerged. I've seen new tested instruments which are actually publicly available, and they're actually better than others which are not publicly available. And the interesting thing is that these instruments, of course, represent usually questionnaires that you would administer after a gameplay experience. However, the quality of these questionnaires, and then in private, I can flag, for example, some that I find particularly interesting, but the quality of these and the nature of these instruments is such that you can think about which indicators you can embed in games to measure whatever then the questionnaires address. And equally important, you can think about which game features you can embed in a game in order to promote whatever the questionnaire is later on trying to assess. So for example, you can imagine what kind of features could promote relatedness between people, collaboration between people, a perception of being able to decide freely, and so on and so forth. So there's an emerging world of instruments that somehow can guide the design of analytics and embedding analytics into games, but also the design of features suitable to promote that. So that's one important thing that I wanted to flag. And possibly that might actually help to drive a change in the relationship between industry, because also it's not about the tool, it's more about how you contextualize the tool and assessment, how you inform the design, etc., etc. So if you wish, we might be looking at a world which is going towards analytics as a public commodity and analysis as a service, because in the end you have to look at where the money is going to come from. and I think that that's the big problem between industry and academia. So maybe knowledge is going to become the commodity, the free commodity, and how to use knowledge to inform design or to assess effects is going to become what can be contextualized for this industry or that industry or this company, that company, and then generated profit. The second thing that I wanted to mention briefly is look outside the world of games. there is a wealth of work that has been done in other fields in which basically what you want to do is investigating how the behavior of other creatures, not just human. The studies in biology in this sense are quite interesting, how the behavior is shaped by the environment. And this is part of the work that we're doing now. We're actually exploring some of the instruments and approaches which have been used for a long time in other fields, and which are focused on precisely that. You have subjects and collectives that work and operate and act in changing environmental conditions, and you want to know which conditions affect this. Does that sound like what we want to do with games? We want to put players into conditions and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much for your answer.
You're most welcome.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I was here trying to solve the sound issue.
That's okay.
So now I will pass the word to my colleague Pedro Neves, which also have a question.
Please.
You're on mute, Pedro.
Well, thank you for that presentation. It was just really zeroing in on what a lot of us are really about these days. Not only it's interesting that people keep just sort of saying, we encourage you to make games for learning like this. I myself have been pushing for basically what you described in terms of giving people conflicting priorities and so forth to be regarded as more of a basic definition of game. So the core idea of game being related to the notion of conflicting priorities and forcing the player to hypothesize. And I certainly, I give my students assignments where this is the kind of game they have to do. They have to engender at some basic level this. Also, it's interesting that you mentioned abductive reasoning as something that is essentially related to games. I mean, games work for this because games are already all of these processes. It's interesting, I teach game design, and when I ask my students to engage in abductive reasoning, 4/5 of them get paralyzed, they freeze up. But one of the things that I find interesting here is that you mentioned that, you know, we're talking about games not because they are fun. This is still a problem when working in GBL. It's because people tend to insist on this idea that, oh, you know, games are motivating. We're going to make learning not as boring to people, and that's what we're delivering. But one thing I found interesting was that you needed, when you discussed context, that the context needs to be authentic. This reminds me when you're creating like game-based interventions alongside, say, psychologists, they tend to mention ecological validity. I'm a bit unsure about this. I mean, I saw that you tried to leaven this statement, maybe not make it an absolute, but I'm unsure about this. I mean, it shouldn't be a sterile simulation, as you said, but isn't there value in using a different context? Since we're imparting mental models and attitudes, isn't there value on using the game as an analogy or a metaphor and letting people rehearse things away? I mean, is this authenticity of context something that we probably shouldn't drop on a lot of context, on a lot of applications, I mean?
Well, thank you for your question, because I think that there is that topic in particular is quite dear to me, and I think it's not straightforward. So what I would like to flag about that is that no, definitely this is not about dropping authenticity in the sense of simulating situations or emulating situations of interest. What I believe should be taken into account is that authenticity is a two-sided coin, right? There is the objective aspect of the world which we would like players to engage with, but there is also the authenticity for the player himself or herself. And one of the things that I find could be dangerous is that we think about the situation that we would like players to engage with without thinking about how meaningful that situation is for them without generating that connection. And this is, for example, this is a strikingly serious problem when considering education for minorities. Because more often than not, what happens is that you have these fantastic games or these fantastic role-playing activities, which are great, but do not mean much for those minorities, do not reflect their culture, do not reflect the problems that they have. They represent another world. And chances are, and this is actually what I found concretely through my work, chances are, some of them, many of them will think, this is not my world. I don't care about it. And I will never engage in this world.
And this isn't how things work out for me normally. The assumptions, yeah.
Exactly. So I think that the struggle in designing authentic gameplay scenarios is understanding what is the portion of authenticity that we have to take from the world which we would like players to engage with, but what is the portion which should resonate as authentic for the player because it has some links with the player's culture. And I'm not talking about just heritage and the past, I'm talking about whatever they live on a daily basis. And whatever should represent a springboard in the end for them to say, okay, whatever I'm doing in this game, in part, that's me. In part, that's the people that I care about. So I want to engage with it. I can do something about that. I want to do something about that. Authenticity in the external world, in the best case scenario is, I can do something about that, but it's not me. So I don't know if I want to do something about that. Why should I? And that's the risk, which can materialize if we don't consider this authenticity, this dual aspect of authenticity, the world and the player, and the player in relation to the world.
So it's not just a question of having accurate signifiers of some objective reality. It's more like, okay, this character encountered a lot of goodwill that I myself would not encounter in my day-to-day life because of my ethnic background or my social background. So it's more verisimilitude rather than realism, you would say.
Exactly.
And there's range of agency, really. Okay. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Thank you for your question.